John's going to join in this panel, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Russell, Stephen, Sunil, and Leonardo.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Well, these couches are nice and comfy. So good morning. My name is Russ Blades, and I guess, as Andrew said, I kind of created this whole interesting discussion. This whole idea on the 100% renewable mine, today is going to be an interesting discussion with this team we have here. I'll get them to introduce themselves in just a minute. But, it's one of those, is this a myth or is this reality? And, what's happening in the marketplace to make this more real? And I think the next hour, I think, will be really interesting to hear from these experts to see what their thoughts are on, what's happening now, what has to happen, and what's the timing of all this. So I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. We'll start with John on my far left.
Thanks, Russell. So I'll be brief. I just presented. So I'm John Mullally. I'm the VP of Corporate Affairs and Energy at Goldcorp.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sunil Kumar. I'm the Senior Director of Energy Strategy and Engineering at Kinross. Kinross is an international gold mining company with assets in Africa, US, Russia, South America. And energy-wise, we spend roughly $400 million a year in terms of overall energy costs. So that's a bit of an overview. Okay.
Hi, good morning. Steve Letwin, President, CEO of IAMGOLD.
Hello, Leo Fashardi. I'm Head of Technical for De Beers in Canada. And I guess the reason I'm here is because of our exciting new project in Baffin Island, which is quite an isolated area. Lots of small diamond pipes, 135 kilometers inland from Iqaluit. And of course, for us, renewable energy is the key driver for that.
Okay, so you see we've got a pretty good mix in this panel. So let's kick things off with the when. When is this going to happen? Is this myth or reality? Who wants to start those discussions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's reality. In fact, we're firm believers in IAMGOLD that it is reality. I think the best example of that is the 15 megawatt solar hybrid farm we built in Burkina Faso right at our mine site. This particular vehicle saves us just under 100 million liters of fuel over the life of the mine. But I would tell you that for us, I think the key here is battery technology. And I would tell you that right now there's a cap. I see a cap of about 20% that we would be able to get to on a hydrocarbon basis for replacement using solar in this particular case. I do believe battery technology is going to improve exponentially. I do believe you're going to be able to store energy from solar and wind, and that will in fact make things a reality from a renewable standpoint. Because for us, it's a huge savings on a yearly basis, and we will push in that direction very aggressively. In fact, right now we're looking at doubling the size of that particular solar farm within the next 3 years.
Thanks, Stephen. Anybody else want to tackle that question?
Yeah, I'll just kind of add to that. Actually, it's a couple of different takes on that. One is actually, if you go back 100 years ago in Ontario, all power was hydroelectric, so you could say at that time we're 100% renewable in terms of serving our industrial loads. A couple of other things is, I think adding to what Steve said, it may not be 100% at each site all the time. There is an optimal for each site, depending on what the energy costs are, risks, and the operational. So I think that's what we need to figure out, is what is that optimal point, and technology will drive that as well. As an example, one of the things we did recently in our operations down in Brazil, quite big in hydroelectric down there. We acquired 2 hydroelectric power plants to serve our power needs. It's about 100 megawatts average power that's available from those power plants, and it meets about 2/3 of our electrical needs at that site.
Thanks, Sunil.
Thanks, Russell. I think, as I was saying in the talk about Cerro Negro and the solutions in Argentina, I think policy will continue to matter in this debate. But that tends, I think, to be a trigger or just almost signals to the industry, and that Some of the opportunities, I think, to pilot or to look at these renewables as a 100% solution depending on the geography. In the case of Burkina Faso, for example, with a lot of sun, in Argentina, where there's tremendous wind resource, but we can power the mine through transmission, as Sunil was saying. And then smaller operations as well, where you can take advantage of potentially battery at a smaller capital cost, so smaller throughputs. And again, I think that battery cost right now is it's prohibitive in some cases, and I think at smaller operations you may be able to test that.
Good. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think just to add to all of the good comments that have been made, I think from our perspective, it's we actually don't really have a choice. So for two reasons. One, the projects that we're dealing with are now very, very remote. So to be honest with you, the opportunity to build traditional power sources is very expensive. The second one, as I think was mentioned yesterday in a lot of the talks, for De Beers, as a consumer-facing product, our customers are really driving forward to make sure that we have a very carbon zero footprint. So we're very strongly driven by that. So I don't know if it's a myth so much as a no-choice situation.
I think those are all good answers. Kind of moving on, I think we all would like to see 100% renewable for a lot of reasons, as were mentioned, costs and looking at greenhouse gas emissions and social responsibility, as well as opening up opportunities, especially remote areas where bringing in infrastructure, bringing in diesel and stuff gets really expensive. And so you've really almost got a stranded asset unless you can figure that out. So what are the barriers today to 100% renewable energy? And also at that point, I also like to address the fact that, let's just not talk about power. The fact when we talk about energy, we also have a lot of material movement, which has traditionally been diesel. How do we address that issue as well? Someone want to take a crack at that?
Maybe I'll kick in on the barriers. I mean, there's clearly technical barriers which have been alluded to in terms of energy storage. The other barrier, I think, is probably quite a subtle one, which is this focus that we have in mining for continuous operations. And I think we may have to adjust that slightly, because to manage the fluctuation of power from natural sources, we may also have to redesign the mine. So the focus for me is very much on focusing on the fundamental footprint of the operation and seeing if we can manage fluctuations. And the other barrier that I think, which is a soft barrier, is definitely a mindset change. Are we able to get to the point where our principals are able to support projects that are perhaps higher in risk and that involve a complete change in the way that we approach mining? So I think they're the key barriers from my side.
Thanks, Leo. John, did you want to say something?
Sure, I was going to say, I think one of the barriers is if we were to think about our customer in gold, it's kind of a nameless and faceless customer. So we would think about probably the employees, our communities, and the market, not necessarily in the order of priority. You determine what priority you put those in. But in the case of, if you look at Apple and Google and others that are moving to 100% renewables through the use of PPAs, et cetera, I mean, they need to react, much like De Beers need to react. But I think mining companies, they don't get those same types of signals from those customers. But if those customers were providing those signals, I think there may be more of an imperative.
Yeah, and I would just add to it, and I'm not, I mean, the way I'm looking at it right now, and we're in the precious metals space, and I'm not sure how much the audience knows, but literally everything we produce as an industry is bought on the east side of the world, that is Asia. So the 3,300 tons of gold that's produced by this industry physically is not purchased at all in North America. And I'm not sure how many people realize that. And one of the struggles we're having as an industry is actually marketing our product. And if we don't do a better job of marketing our product, then I think we're under serious threat in terms of being able to sustain the industry. Now, one of the ways we can do that, and this is self-serving obviously, is to tie the fact that we are an environmentally friendly industry to the consumer. A lot of those being millennials. I have a 27-year-old son in Los Angeles. He asked me, "Dad, why are you in this business?" like, what is this? He has no thought of purchasing gold, ever. And everything is driven from his phone. So that's the consumer of the future or today. And I think as an industry, if we're able to tie the production of our product to an environmentally friendly energy source, that will go a long way if you view gold as a currency or as a protector during a currency downfall, which I think everybody's concerned about. We'll have a much better ability to market our product in the future. And blockchain, letting people know that as a industry we are actually concerned about the environment, about the carbon footprint, you will go a long way to convincing my son that this is a product that he should consider.
Makes sense.
Yeah, just to add a couple other things to that in terms of examples. One is talk about on-grid systems and off-grid systems. If you talk about systems that are on-grid, one of the other issues or challenges we see sometimes is you still need the utility for backup power, because you may not be able to, if you, let's say, put in your own renewable asset and site, you still need the utility for backup and during other times. And so what is the charges that they put on you, the either exit fees or backup charges? We see sometimes the numbers that come in are quite high, which then when you start looking at the economics of doing your own self-generation using renewables, that has a negative impact in that. So that's an example where you're on-grid systems. And off-grid systems, and this was alluded to earlier, what is the highest percentage that we can get? Right now we're seeing 20 to 25% renewable. Maybe we can go to 40 or 50, but to try to get to 100, that's where battery technologies come in. And one of the key things to remember in operating plants and mills is a lot of the equipments like the SAG mills and ball mills are very, very fussy in terms of the quality of power that they need, voltage and frequency. A little bit of instability in there, and because your system can't respond enough, let's say the amount of solar goes down, your battery system or other systems can't pick it up, your mill goes down, and then you're not just down for a few minutes, you could be down for hours as you try to recover that. So from the operating point of view, that's the other thing to kind of look at is battery technologies come in and how do we integrate everything together while still keeping reliable operation.
Sunil, I think also along that line, which is kind of interesting, is on the demand side. Like, as you were mentioned on mills, like mills are 3 to 5% efficient. So if part of the technology could address that, that means you can bring down the load requirements significantly in mines, which makes it much easier to provide the power needs for. The other thing I find in mining is we tend not to be very good at capturing heat. And so when you have things like autoclaves that are exothermic, and we're just wasting that heat, where if you look at it, you could be recovering that and actually producing power, I think that's the other thing that we have to look at as well. Beside the supply side, looking at the demand side, looking at how we reduce those loads, and then looking at our processes to see, can we capture heat to produce power or steam or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you look at most of the process plants, especially in gold, process really haven't changed in the last several decades, and I think it's only now there's a lot of efforts looking at new comminution technologies, mine to mill, and those types of efforts. So absolutely, that'll help.
So moving on, let's talk about technology. Let's talk about transport and infrastructure technologies. You know, we're seeing a lot of other industries moving to electric vehicles. You know, what's happening in the mining space? Is this something that we're seeing more of? Obviously, we're starting to see Goldcorp with the underground mine all electric. But what about the large trucks? What about open pit? What about the infrastructure? Is batteries and stuff where they need to be? Or is there still improvements that need to be made as well as costs need to come down before we start to see the 100% renewable mine site?
Well, I can talk to, similar to Goldcorp, that has a very successful operation in Chapleau. We're going to build out our Côté project, which is a bit south of Chapleau, about 2 hours drive. It's $1 billion US mine. It'll be a 425,000 ounce producer for about 20 plus years. Open pit. and it's going to be fully autonomous vehicles. So, we've gone to literally every place on the planet to study it. We've had a lot of research done on it, and including the success that Goldcorp has had, which we applaud. And we're definitely moving in that direction as part of our plan. It's fully supported by our partner, Sumitomo. It was interesting. Their number one question was, will these autonomous vehicles work in Canadian winters? And which is a good question, right? I mean, when you think about it. And the answer is yes, because they use it at the oil sands in Alberta. So yeah, there's a lot of proof of concept there. But the beautiful thing about the Cote project is our pit to mill is 1 kilometer. So it really lends itself to an autonomous vehicle concept. I think the autonomous vehicles are here. They're going to move. You can see it coming quite aggressively. Safety's improved. Productivity's improved. The biggest issue in all of this equation is the labor issue, and the fact that 40% of our mine population are usually our truck drivers and or drivers of some sort. So if you take that amount of labor out of the equation over time, it's the kind of similar reaction you get to the GM Oshawa closing. People want to work. So that human element, when we talk about technology, has to be incorporated as we move forward. Training and development needs to be addressed, or that will be a huge impediment to what our dreams are around renewables and energy efficient vehicles.
Anyone else?
Sure. You mentioned the Borden mine, Russell. So I think that's another case where site-specific can drive certain types of technologies and allow us to pilot things. And in the case, this is not a big volume open pit. This is 2,000 tons per day. It's an underground mine. And the other thing that it makes such a big difference as well is the health and safety improvements. So it's the technology, the health and safety improvements, and then what goes along with that are some significant ventilation savings, so massive reduction in electricity consumed. And what I think Borden will do is we'll start to see more evidence from the OEMs, and we'll be able to tie it up in a nice case to really demonstrate that first off the technology works, because we're still waiting on a 40-ton truck. So a 40-ton battery electric truck is coming to Borden in 2020, early 2020, for the operations, when the operations go into commercial production. And that, by the way, too, indicates that Goldcorp was willing to take on a little bit of risk. So some risk appetite, I think, is important in these areas, as it relates to autonomous as well, when it comes to your labor risk and your and labor relations. So I think the environment, in the case of our all electric, there are just a number of trends and signals. In the case of the provincial government, even they've been changing signals, but there was some signals and now there's some other signals. So those things, I think, do help us move in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's one of the advantages, obviously, when you start to go to all-electric transportation, then that helps to introduce things like renewables, but then you've got storage issues, but you also, on the positive side, can take advantage of things like regeneration, which you typically don't have when you're using diesel trucks. So I think it's that neat combination of looking how you can apply all those different things.
I think we don't have an underground mine in Canada at the moment. We had the Snap Lake mine. When we looked at electrifying that, it came up with the unusual situation where the cost of the electricity was almost cheaper to generate it in the truck because you're essentially powering the mine with a diesel powered generator. So unfortunately that didn't go anywhere, although it would have had a huge value proposition in terms of managing the ventilation. But just to pick up on the point that was made earlier about the social impact of all this technology, I think is quite a significant one. Autonomous trucks being one thing, but just even the equipment that we're considering now in mines, every single thing, I mean, you're really looking at different jobs to the jobs that exist on any of the operations. So, I mean, the community value proposition is very difficult to achieve. I don't think you can source people for those positions, even in established mining areas, let alone in remote northern communities. So I don't have a clear answer for this. I mean, one of the things is, I thought the talks presented about bringing, it's like an offsetting model, where you're bringing value to the community, but it might not necessarily be direct jobs. It may be bringing power or bringing infrastructure and roads and what have you. It's definitely something that needs to be woven into the discussion on renewables and technology in general.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I know when I was at Barrick and we were looking at, one of the issues was, as you start to move into electric vehicles and stuff, you change the dynamics. You're not looking at diesel mechanics anymore. Now you're almost looking at electricians. And so it changes that whole dynamics, as I said, on who are going to be your laborers and where are you going to get them from, and that whole education that has to go with that transition.
Well, yeah, and I mean, so I'm 63, I drive an MDX, and I had a problem with it. And grew up on a farm, used to be able to fix things. I opened up the hood, I mean, I had no idea. And, you know, took it into the Acura dealership, and, you know, they have all these computers to do all the metrics and testing. You know, we have a ways to go to train a lot of our staff, a lot of our laborers about what this really means. A long way to go.
There's a whole change management that has to be looked at as part of that solution. No, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so just to kind of add to that, the whole operating philosophy as well in minds. People are very conservative. Here's what they're used to. And along comes an autonomous vehicle. How do you operate that? Having the trust factor related to it. So it's going to take time for that to happen. The other thing I just want to add, and we're looking at infrastructure, is one of the advantages of renewables is it minimizes some of the infrastructure requirements on the other side, on the fuel side. So let's say you're a remote mine, your base case is you've got a self-generation, you're bringing in the fuel. The infrastructure related to that is huge in terms of getting it to some ports, fuel storage, then trucking it to site. In one site, we actually have to build a winter ice road to get it to site. So just the infrastructure costs related to that are huge as well. So when we're looking at renewable generation on site versus conventional fuel, that's another factor to put in.
Yeah, Sunil, and it's one of those other things that nobody wants to talk about, but also theft, right? As soon as you have diesel, there's always that potential issue.
Yeah, I was going to mention on some of the challenges on employment as well, which is really attracting people to some of the remote locations, as well. You know, being perceived as a leader. So if we're going to try to attract Steve's son out of Los Angeles, we're going to have to deploy some serious technology here. So one of the things we did a survey of 50 underground mine developers a couple months back at Borden, and what was interesting was we found, and I was always told that a development miner would always leave for a higher salary no matter what. And so we had 2 or 3 miners who actually came back to Borden on account of the air quality, and we were paying them less. Now, I don't mean to advertise the fact that we're paying them less, but it's important for the anecdote. But it's you know, so we're not talking about we're not talking about software developers or anything like that. We're talking about people who still constitute the biggest proportion of our workers are those that work in the underground environment, and therefore, you know, this technology is critical to keeping those people healthy and retained, keeping them in the workplace and satisfied.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and I think it goes beyond just employees. Without naming the fund, we had a fund that came into IAMGOLD, bought about 7 million shares, about a $50 million US investment, probably about 8 months ago. It's a $1 trillion fund. Their number one issue was around environment. And they wouldn't even begin to talk to us if they weren't satisfied that our corporate social responsibility program, our environmental program, met their requirements. They didn't even want to talk about metrics around cash flow or anything else until that box was checked. And I think most funds are going that route. So this isn't about, you know, thinking about whether or not you need to be friendly to the environment. This is about, if you want to have funds invest in your company, you better have a program that gets you there.
Okay, so when you talk about renewables, there's always that issue on intermittency. So what is the solution? I mean, you've got some renewables like geothermal and some hydro that can give you those base loads, but then you've got things like wind and solar that are intermittent. How do we address that issue? Because that's one of the things that come up when I know we would talk about using renewable energy. It was like, yeah, but the sun doesn't shine all the time. How are we going to operate a mine 24/7 under those conditions? So let's address that kind of issue, that kind of elephant in the room, so to speak.
So I can't talk to the technological element of that. I do believe that, I think Steve made the point of a battery technology is dramatically improving and is getting very cost effective. So that's clearly the one. I do want to bring up the point though about changing the mind to adapt to the energy. It's a little bit of a dream and a vision right now as opposed to something that's very concrete, but we do have a culture of continuous operations, and there's a good reason for that. It's an economy of scale business that we run. In the 100% renewable space, I think that may have to change. So you are looking at a battery cost, or you're looking at a very high infrastructure cost for conventional power, or you may actually be looking at putting your cost into having fluctuating production. And I suppose I don't have the specifics around that, but to me that's the sort of mindset that I think may need to be done to address that situation, while in parallel the technology is catching up.
Yeah, I think we're looking at some kind of a hybrid system, and that hybrid will vary with the facility. You may have a renewable energy source, a battery source. If you're off-grid, you may have a thermal power source as well, or if you're on-grid, maybe you've got the grid as a backup power. So I think with technology changing, what that optimal point keeps changing as well, but I think it's going to have to be some hybrid solution. You can't just rely on one energy source by itself.
Yeah, you change battery technology to the point where you can store solar, you will change the world. You will change Africa. And I believe in my heart of hearts that that's going to happen. And I'm not sure when it's going to happen, maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, hopefully. But I know at our site in Burkina Faso, where we spend probably around 80 million a year on fuel, that you can basically eliminate that with good battery technology and your PV solar cells now that are coming out. That is a huge extension to the life of the mine. It really keeps the community engaged. And if we can bring that into places like Africa, it changes Africa dramatically. So I'm very hopeful that's going to happen.
Just to add on to Steve's point, I think there's once the technology gets there, and then there's another matter, which is when the companies choose to commercialize that technology, to deploy that technology. I heard about one yesterday, compressed air energy storage. This is a 30-year, or I don't even know, older technology. And it's not really commonly deployed. From technological perspective, it seems very much ready to go, and it can provide much more storage readily in larger load and larger supplies than batteries could at a much lower cost. But it's the kind of technology that I think that operators can look at and just sort of say, well, I just don't know. So I think that really does impede the rate of adoption for us.
Yeah, and the other thing is, as miners, the other thing we should be looking at is pumped hydro storage. If you look at pumped hydro storage, where basically you take water, you move it to a higher elevation, and then during the day or during the nighttime, you release that. If you look at mining, if you look at pumped hydro storage, one of the biggest costs, the capital cost, is in the civil works, right? But we're already as part of open pits and even underground mines, we're already creating that. And so, maybe there should be some more work done on that, and we're seeing that actually already. You're seeing here in Ontario, they've looked at pumped hydro from old mining sites. I know at Berwick we had one of our old mining sites in Australia. They're about 250 megawatts of pumped hydro storage. So, those are some of the other things that are already being used for hundreds of years that maybe the mining industry needs to take a look at. Okay, we've talked about a lot of the social and the environmental benefits of going with renewables. Obviously, one of the other things we really need to talk about is, what are the cost benefits? What are the kind of cost benefits we think we'll see or we are seeing by moving to renewable energy?
Yeah, so I mean, that's clearly in this conference I've seen evidence that in certain circumstances the renewable energy is now as cheap as conventional energy, and that's without a shadow of a doubt the case in Africa and Chile, and where there's fantastic natural resources there. I think in the remote environments that we play in, the cost is the value proposition has to come in to a very, building, essentially avoiding a large amount of infrastructure for a conventional solution. So in the case of having to build a road, if you can avoid building an all-season road, for example, that's a major cost, and that in fact is essentially a cost of diesel. So I think that's where you'll see that value case being established in an off-grid scenario. And the other one, I suppose, to comment on here is that inevitably it's a trade-off. It was nicely shown in the last presentation between high capital or high operating cost, and inevitably there is a desire. There's always seemingly a restriction on capital. So I suppose that's the other paradigm that one has to play in. In terms of voting projects through, there is a certain degree of the planets always having to align, and I suppose it's good to always look at different options, as in capital versus OPEX options, where depending on how your company is doing at the time, that you can put both of those through.
I think that, and to the point, I think a lot of progress has been made on structuring these vehicles. And I'll just use the example again at Essakane, where Aron Energy came in, put up the $23.5 million US to build the 133,000 solar panels. And we structured a take-or-pay that was tied over a 9.5 year mine life at 17 cents a kilowatt hour, relative to hydrocarbon costs, which were sitting around 22 cents. So we saved around $20 million US in terms of costs. And so they're able to come in and structure something where we don't have to put up the capital, which for miners today is a major challenge. And we literally pay as we use the power over the life of mine. That cost of power then drops to 3 cents a kilowatt hour in year 9. And because we've had exploration success around the mine, that life of mine has been extended. So the costs literally go to zero with no capital up front. So I think today, if the mining industry uses that, and you can use it in wind, you can use it in biomass, there are those vehicles out there, and there are funds that are willing to put up that money because they're making a reasonable rate of return over the life of the mine, and it's friendly. So I think if we look hard enough, mining can find a way to finance this and move ahead a little more quicker than they have been.
Yeah, when we look at projects and investments, obviously we look at CapEx and OpEx and the trade-offs between them. A couple of other things that become very important for us. One is looking at reliability of the energy source. So in a lot of locations, the grid power is not very reliable, but if you can have your own power source, that increases the reliability, and there's a huge value to that. The other very important one is looking at, call it risk mitigation, especially if you're buying fuel. The fuel price in the market goes up and down, very hard to predict. And especially in mining, you're trying to forecast your costs and budgets. Having a renewable energy source where you have a much better idea as to what the costs are, costs get locked in, that's got a huge value within the company as well.
Yeah, I think sharing the capital up front, finding, working at the utility, for example, or joint ventures. So we look at, we have the Norte Abierto project with Barrick and the Nuevo Union project, and these become more manageable types of investments when we look at that, so sharing that cost. And then the closure liability, I think, as well, is a cost that we need to keep in mind. So sort of if there's a neighboring community, or how can we actually make this asset useful for another party once the life of mine is complete.
So we kind of actually answered kind of two questions. The next one was really how do we look at CapEx and OpEx in our life of mine models, and I think we kind of talked about that as well. So I'll kind of move on. What are the examples of current projects meeting these high renewable penetration around the world? And we'll also look at the same time, what energy intensive industries are leading the charge on 100% renewables? So kind of both those questions given our time.
So I'm not an expert in those areas, but I have been very uplifted to come to this conference and see a number of companies with the hybrid solutions. And to me, my takeaway is the hybrid is the new norm. So particularly in Africa, particularly in Chile, where this fantastic solar resources exist. So numerous of the examples that were presented yesterday. It would interest me to see a lot more of the wind hybrid. It seems to be a little bit more relevant to northern Canada. To me, that's, in some respects, if you want to see the examples, just look around this room here.
Yeah, I just look at it quite simply and say, the world has 7 billion people inhabiting it today. It's going to 9 billion over the next 25 years. 1 billion of those are in Africa. And right now, Africa doesn't have enough energy to meet the needs of the people in Africa. 53 countries. Renewables, to me, are a given. We've got to move ahead with renewables, or we're going to have a lot of social issues around migration. We think we have a problem now with migration. Take a look at what it's going to be like in 25 years when you add 1 billion people to the continent of Africa and don't have enough resources to feed them. So energy is absolutely critical for our survival as an industry, as a community. We've got to make sure that this investment continues at a very aggressive pace.
Thanks, Stephen.
In terms of industries that are leading, if you kind of look around, a lot of the ones that are consumer product oriented seem to be very advanced. You always hear about Apple and Google and others getting into that. Actually, the mining side, you see some companies that are into lithium mining, obviously, into battery technology. They're also getting really into renewables as well.
I thought a heavy industry example that I saw the other day, Maersk, the Danish shipping company, use bunker fuel, the heaviest carbon intensity there is, and they made a commitment to go zero carbon by 2050, which I thought was pretty aspirational.
Do we have time for questions? Okay.
Arnold of R for Mining. More than a question, is a comment for you, Rachel, and for all people. Because thanks to the example of 100% renewables of Zaldívar mine, I was visited in the last month, I was visited Peru and Chile. Visited 8 mines. In that moment, BHP and Codelco, they have specific programs from between 4 and 6 years to get 100% renewables. That means between 12 and 15 terawatts hour a year. So the question or comment, and that's all. Thank you very much and excellent.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Raziel Zisman at Whittle Consulting. All the introduction of new technologies may come, in a sense, free, because if you lower your OPEX, you may be able to increase the reserves at the mine site. And then it's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's number one. Number two, employment is a very important component. At IMARC, I spoke with an Australian company that is building an automated mine, underground mine in Mali. And I asked him, so how is it going to work with the government? I said, the community doesn't care because we never unemployed anybody. There's a new project that comes in the way it is. And it's an interesting way of looking. We're not going to fly Dreamliners with 7 pilots in the cockpit. So we need to approach it. We cannot afford not to do it in a very advanced way, but at the same time, we have to be socially responsible and collaborate with the community, as in Perito Moreno in Argentina.
Thank you.
This is quite the microphone for this thing. Eric Muller, IESO. I just wanted to comment to Stephen that your comments about your son really resonated with me personally, because I'm also a millennial, and my friends and I are often talking about when we're investing, social impact investing, ESG, environment, social governance, and so I just wanted to ask you and others, how much is that driving your decisions beyond, the large funds that you had mentioned in your example, from just overall millennials and the future of investors looking for this type of ESG in all sectors?
Well, we have, I don't know if Tony Moreau is here. You hear Tony somewhere? We have somebody dedicated completely to innovation, Thomas Lee, who's here. I will tell you, it's very top of mind for me. And it's the sustainability of our business is tied to the desire of the market to purchase the product. It's no different than selling Coca-Cola or an Apple iPhone. If you don't have a consumer who wants your product, you're obviously going to die as a business. And right now, of the 3,300 tons of gold that this industry produces, 88% of it is purchased in China, India, Russia, Malaysia. Very little of it is produced or purchased in Canada, as an example, and we're the fourth largest producer. So the millennials are looking at gold in a very different way today, and we need to help change the perception that A, it's friendly, B, it's worth something. And let's start with friendly. And to them, the environment, and you know this better than anybody, is top of mind. So if we want to survive, we need to convince them on that top box, we are environmentally friendly, and renewables is a critical part of that.
Yeah, when we do projects, obviously sustainability is a big part of it. The other part also is as we go into operations, the whole community relationships and managing things for the community and providing benefits to them on an ongoing basis, that's a key part. And especially when you get to Africa, as Stephen was saying, the infrastructure there is so little. Whatever we're able to bring to the community in terms of things like basic health care and school and all of those other things, those are very, very vital for us and for the community.
Yeah, I think obviously we see that in De Beers on the high street directly. So we have the Forevermark brand, we've got 2,000 stores on the high street. We get immediate feedback from what consumers are wanting. People buy diamonds to mark very significant moments in their lives. They don't want them to have any sense of tarnish. And the key part of that is it's got to come from a renewable, well, an energy efficient, carbon neutral environment. We also, as you're probably aware, are facing a lot of competition from lab-grown diamonds. So again, this thrust towards renewable power to us is almost like non-negotiable.
I think the mining industry has to also do a better job of helping the millennials and just the public relate between mining and things like this, right? So when my son asked me, what about mining? I said, if you want to keep using this, that's why we have mining. And I think the industry has to do a better job of kind of joining those dots for people. And as part of that process, as the panel were saying, show that mining can be done in a sustainable fashion, and it can be done using renewable energy, all those type of things. I think that's where I think our industry has to do a better job.
If I may though, it's also good to get the pushback from society. I think it makes us better people, it makes us better miners. Yeah. So I actually welcome the sort of, the comments that are made and the pushback that we're getting from our consumers, because what is it doing? It's driving us to a much better place. So I see that as a very positive thing.
Do we have time for another question?
I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you.